So thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. As mentioned, my name is Neil Thacker. I'm the CISO for EMEA for Netscope, and I am going to be talking about, again, the business value with SASE. Just a quick show of hands. Who is familiar with the term SASE or Secure Access Service Edge? Okay, great. So about half of the room. Okay. So it's always tough when you put in a presentation and you're up against another talk that's focused on data science and machine learning. And of course, I've used the term here, but this is hopefully beneficial to both defenders from how organizations are adapting and changing, perhaps their enterprises, but also from an attacker perspective. If you're a red teamer, perhaps, again, understanding how organizations are typically moving away from a traditional corporate network, and again, moving to this type of, architecture. And as I said, it stands for Secure Access Service Edge. So we're seeing more and more organizations look to move and lift and shift many of their security controls, again, to that edge. Just a quick introduction to me. I spent about 20 years now, over 20 years. We stopped counting after 20 years, I think, until you get to 30 years. 20 years in IT security. That's what we called it in back in the day. And then, of course, information security and now cybersecurity. I spent a number of years in financial services, running security teams, running security operations, running, again, red team, blue team, purple team exercises. I keep my certifications up to date for the auditors. But again, I also, I love what I do. And in my spare time, I'm co-founder to the Security Advisor Alliance. This is a non-profit aimed at bringing more people into cybersecurity. So giving talks in schools, colleges, universities, try to bring more people into the industry. I also am advisory council member to the Cloud Security Alliance. I've been following CSA and all the way back to the kind of the Jericho forum days. So again, over 20 years ago, when Jericho spoke about, again, a deperimetization and how this would occur over the next 10 years, I think it was. We're still seeing organizations going through that phase. And then finally, I spent 7 years with ENISA, again, volunteering my time, working with ENISA, the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, specifically on, again, cloud and cloud threats. Again, working with them closely. My last day with ENISA was on the 31st of January, 2020. That was the day that the UK left the EU. So that was my official last day, and I was not necessarily escorted to the airport, but again, I kind of waved goodbye to the EU on that day, and then forevermore I've had to join the long queues at airports, right? So again, that's my role, my background, again, my experience. But today I wanted to talk about two things. Again, the business value of SASE, but also talking about where organizations are today and perhaps where they're heading towards in the future. And of course, for anything future, you have to look at, again, for instance, artificial intelligence to help us understand, well, what is the future going to look like? And again, last week, when many people had access to DALI 2, this week it's just not been available. There's too many people using it. I asked, again, DALI 2, what would, again, the next 20 years look like in terms of a visual representation? And this is what it created for me. And I was pretty impressed. I was like, yeah, okay, this looks great. This looks like there is a future. I know it's pretty tough times at the moment, but it looks like there is a future. There is some modernization there. But then also I started looking at the kind of almost like desolate wasteland that was summarized at the bottom. And then I noticed the car in the middle, and I thought, that kind of looks like a car from Mad Max. So perhaps the future isn't as perhaps amazing as it looks on here. Perhaps, again, we are looking at some challenges. And of course, a lack of people commuting was kind of interesting. The second image I actually, again, preferred, and it kind of highlights perhaps where people would be kind of what the work of the future would look like, how people would, again, work moving forward. And of course, you can probably look at this and say, well, it looks like a form of augmented reality. Again, somebody kind of wired, connected, working really hard. But again, in the next 20 years, it looks like, according to DALI 2, that the keyboard will still be alive and carpal tunnel perhaps will still be a thing. So again, looking at the future, perhaps this is what the next 20 years looks like. But if we look at today, right now, how organizations are going through, again, a form of change, we need to start looking at, again, perhaps what happened in the last 20 years until the present day. What has exactly changed? And as I mentioned, I've been in this industry now 20 years. And I remember one of my first roles was to ensure that people could securely access, again, the office through a VPN. Predominantly, it was around accessing email, right? That was the main use case for people to connect in. But again, if I now fast track and look at the current modern enterprise with hybrid work and digital transformation, I can see there's a whole, again, huge uplift in terms of devices connecting in, services being consumed, and again, it becomes a real challenge for today's modern enterprise. The challenges typically seen, however, is that there are still some traditional tools being used, like a VPN, like a web proxy, to try to, again, secure the organization. And really, back in the, even going back before 2003, back into the 90s, the VPN was really, again, in terms of its business use, it was really only designed for, again, an exception. Wasn't necessarily to continually secure and allow people to connect into, again, those offices. In most cases, there was only a few applications there anyway. But of course, as we start looking at, again, the hybrid work and transformation, we now see organizations consuming thousands of different services, connecting to all these services. And of course, people don't want to utilize a VPN to connect back into a data center, to connect back out to access their cloud services. It just makes no sense. So for many organizations, they've already started to change this, of course, changing the way that they connect or allow their employees to connect to these services. It has created somewhat of a complex environment. And of course, whenever you have complexity, it usually is the enemy of security, right? We normally have organizations that have very complex networks, a very complex set of security controls. Each one has its own policy. Each one has a configuration. Each one, of course, will need to be patched and updated. And it becomes, again, a real big challenge. But of course, these types of, again, the complex environments are being used, again, by the attackers to, again, launch things like drive-bys, which we've had for many, many years. Because, again, perhaps they're not being able to be identified because of the large volume of events that are being created. Perhaps it could be that in some cases that, again, the cloud is being used as a vector. And I'll come on to that a bit later on. It could even be that, for instance, the supply chain attack, again, we've seen a huge increase in supply chain attacks where even third parties are targeted to access an organization. And again, that could also be through the use of, again, cloud services. But if I'm going to start really looking at perhaps one of the main challenges is how organizations are looking to move away from the VPN. And this isn't a new concept. Of course, we've had some great papers. Google, for instance, talked about their Beyond Corp many years ago. For most organizations, it feels like last year, this year, there's been an acceleration in terms of moving away from that VPN. And of course, there's many reasons to do so. VPN was great in its day for connecting people into, again, networks. It's great, of course, if you want to access other services away from a network and you want to be anonymized, etc. Of course, great use cases. But for most organizations in their enterprise, they really want to move away from this type of approach because, of course, it becomes complex to restrict. It becomes complex to secure that network when you start opening up ports, protocols, and allowing people access to a portion of the network. And of course, we've seen challenges with organizations right now with performance because they now have more people trying to connect to through a VPN. Perhaps a few years ago, the answer was, well, buy more VPN, buy more services, buy more concentrators. But actually what we're seeing, this change, is that, again, wanting to move away from that, to scale more effectively, to reduce the complexity, in many cases, to also prevent lateral movement. Okay, there's been a big drive right now in terms of moving away from VPNs because the possibilities that lie in place in terms of lateral movement. And actually, if you look at the last few years in terms of specific attacks, there's been a 20x increase in attacks against VPN services. And pretty much every month or every week that goes by, I typically see a new vulnerability that's been discovered, again, on a VPN service. Interestingly enough, what I've seen is that very few organizations actually keep up to date with patching their VPN services. And of course, those VPN services can be a gateway into an organization as well. And of course, there's a number of groups that are specifically targeting VPN vulnerabilities. I won't go through the details here, but again, we've seen a huge increase in terms of, again, these types of attacks. So the answer in terms of VPN was typically looking at things like a zero trust network access capability. And actually, if you look at the prediction in the next, if we look at this in the next 2 years, that 70% of new remote access deployments will be through a zero trust network access capability. And again, I'm seeing that this year. Lots and lots of new projects where organizations have said, again, because of those previous challenges, they're looking to move to a ZTNA approach. So there's a big shift for organizations today. If I look at, again, other aspects of this, so beyond the VPN, but looking at web gateway, web proxy, how people typically are even looking to move data outside of the organization. I mean, the last few days, there's been some great talks on terms of how to do that and how to, again, do that without being detected, and again, using perhaps new vulnerabilities, new flaws. But if I look at this, again, we've even seen quite an interesting evolution of phishing, drive-by, data exfil attacks, where even, again, really simple procedures are in place, really simple tactics and techniques are in place to do so. I'm going to start off, though, with one of my favorite phishing attacks ever. This goes back, I think it was 2 years ago. I saw this, and it really kind of changed my life in terms of speaking about phishing. It's a phishing 101 exercise. So the phishing attack started off, it came from, allegedly, again, I can't prove this is incorrect, by the way. It came from a Nigerian prince. Okay, we all know this is pretty, again, a common tactic. A Nigerian prince, unfortunately, he was in space, and he was stuck on a space station, and he couldn't get back down to Earth. He'd been up there since 2009. This was in the build-up to the execution and the demand. He'd been there since 2009. And he'd been very successful. He'd been bored in his spare time. He'd been mining Bitcoin, right, since 2009. Don't we all wish we'd been mining Bitcoin in 2009? Perhaps not so much on a space station, but he was there. He was requesting that you send a wire to Elon Musk, not PayPal, because Elon Musk doesn't like PayPal anymore because he obviously sold off the organization, but send a wire to Elon Musk. It was $3,000, and that demand was, okay, if I send you $3,000, or if I receive $3,000 via Elon Musk, if I get 100 people to do so, that would justify me or qualify me to get a seat on the next spacecraft that's coming to space, bring me back home, and then I can share my Bitcoin wealth with you. So the return on investment, I think, was over 100 times. Okay. So the goal was, again, the Nigerian prince, the astronaut, comes back down to Earth and shares his wealth. But of course, what happened is it wasn't just a targeted act specifically on, again, sending money, a wire, but it was also on a credential harvesting campaign. And as I said, the goal was, again, you would generate 100 times your investment and your Bitcoin wealth would dramatically increase. The best line of all, after that whole story, by the way, this was a very successful campaign. Lots of people fell for this. Was that it was 100% risk-free. It was a guarantee that you would get this payout. So again, a very simple, hard to believe exercise, but lots and lots of people fell for this. And again, it was an interesting exercise in terms of phishing. But if I now fast track into, again, what we're seeing in terms of the abuse of digital trust in phishing, we've seen, again, even simple techniques, people falling for. So, of course, quick show of hands, who would click on this link? Yeah. I expected a few more hands because well, hang on a minute, you've got free malware, click here, we can take this, we can sample this, we can run this in our environments, we can perhaps do some reverse engineering. I think it was about 0.4% of people clicked on this link. Perhaps they didn't know what malware was, or perhaps they were looking at trying to get new malware samples. But again, lots of people still clicked on this link. When we look at this type of link, and I've actually redacted this, because this was again serving up live malware, a live malware binary. This is if you're familiar with OneDrive, this is a link to OneDrive. I think it was over 60% of people clicked on this link. So actually a far, higher, greater success rate. But again, many people have been told, for instance, to look out for suspicious links and perhaps anything that has a form of trust. If you're familiar with using OneDrive, you're more than likely, if somebody sends you a link, you're more than likely to trust that link and click on that link. But as I said, we're seeing a huge increase in the use of cloud to deliver malware. But it's not just cloud, of course, to harvest and collect credentials. As we've seen, again, targeted specifically attacks. Whenever you put a Microsoft logo in the top left, people are more likely to enter their details and perhaps provide credentials into their Microsoft account. And we've even seen some new techniques where, of course, people put in their details and it collects and harvests that information. But when they do this 2 or 3 times and they next click on sign in, it redirects them to their official Microsoft login page where they can actually log in. I don't think that's still ethical, of course, to do that. But again, it's an interesting technique. So perhaps the next time you go to log into Microsoft and it doesn't allow you in, perhaps think about that. Again, has my information been harvested? So again, be aware of that. We're seeing this huge increase in the use of, again, well-known cloud services also to host and collect this information. We even saw, again, an example where this type of page, service, site, etc. was hosted. Everything looked to be Microsoft, signed by Microsoft, but it was hosted on an AWS platform as well. And that's not a new business offering by AWS, by the way, to host malicious pages. That's just the preferred threat actors platform. And actually, if we start looking at cloud-delivered threats, again, there has been this huge increase. In the last year, so in 2022, OneDrive, of the top 5 cloud services and applications that were used to host and deliver malware binaries, OneDrive had over half of that malware delivery mechanism. We then had GitHub, Box, SharePoint, SourceForge, etc. But the number goes into, again, hundreds and thousands of cloud services being used to host, again, malware. And again, it's not a new business opportunity or revenue model for these providers. It's just that abuse of those digital trust platforms. If I start looking at even the basics of data exfiltration, this is a common challenge that organizations have today. It's, what do I do about non-corporate instances of cloud services? So the example is, if you're using a Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace platform in your organization, of course, there's a corporate version of that instance itself. And you would typically, most organizations, of course, would put in an allow to obviously allow people to utilize that service. Some people may put in a reverse proxy to allow for BYOD devices and personal devices to access those services. And of course, some organizations would then say, okay, well, again, we want you to access third-party services as well to collaborate with our partners. But in most cases, organizations are not realizing that, of course, this then just opens up everybody to access any type of Google Drive instance available. So you're seeing a huge increase in terms of data exfiltration that occurs when, again, multiple personal instances of Google Drive are being used, as just one example. So, of course, you can do 2 things. You can say, well, I can block, but then I can block everything apart from my corporate instance. But in those cases, I'm going to be blocking access to third parties. And what would happen typically is probably exceptions will be put in place. And managing exceptions is pretty tough. Or, of course, I take the risk and I allow. And if that's the example, then in many cases, again, there's going to be a likelihood of, again, sensitive data movement as well that occurs. And of course, even if data goes to those services, there's a likelihood of, again, that third party not perhaps putting in good security hygiene and controls around those services as well, for that data to perhaps be shared more publicly as well. We've even seen, of course, more recent examples with things like Microsoft Teams Premium, where you'll have your GPT-enabled capability as well. So you could be joining a Microsoft Teams meeting. Anything you say, not necessarily the team session may not be recorded, but the dialect being spoken is being stored as part of an automated meeting notes process. And of course, that data then may be accessible by, again, that third party, or even may be used potentially against, again, the participants who have been on that call as well. So again, look out and perhaps ask those questions around the use of, again, those premium type tools that have the AI capabilities built in as well. So again, these are really simple data exfiltration techniques. We've seen organizations that perhaps don't have controls for this. We know that there's, again, great ways of masking, hiding data for data exfil. But even if in these situations, we've seen organizations just not have visibility into data directory that occurs between cloud services as well. So to summarize again, how does SASE Zero Trust actually help many of these challenges that we have? Again, the challenging environment, the challenging capabilities we've had to implement over many, many years to build, again, this complex environment. But then also, again, even some of the basic techniques of trying to get into organizations and either compromise or leak data. So for those not familiar with SASE pretty much is a combination of your networking as a service capabilities. So typically your proxy, your SD-WAN type capabilities, as well as, again, those security as a service components as well. And of course, they're typically hosted in a cloud environment. They're hosted at the edge. And in many cases, they've been designed, of course, based on microservices without the need to deploy any hardware or on-prem type requirements. So you'll see things there. So on the security side, secure gateway, the ability to do, of course, SSL TLS inspection at scale, to do verification of API JSON calls back into cloud services. You'll see the elements of CASB that can identify, again, the difference between a personal, corporate, third-party instance of a cloud service, doing things like cloud security posture management, SaaS security posture management, the ability to tie in zero trust network access to that same rule set as well. Ultimately, so the person that's utilizing this service doesn't have to decide, well, do I need to enable the VPN or not? It will just steer the traffic to the destination. And then you've got capabilities like data protection, threat protection, sandboxing, all of those things also built in as well. So this is where the value really sits. It's a case of looking at this as in terms of a consolidating approach. So networking and security as a service, but looking at how you consolidate and converge many of these requirements. And again, this is why we're seeing this as a key initiative for many organizations today. It's either being led by the networking team or it's being led by the security team. And actually, we're seeing this year more commonly these teams converging elements of budgets to looking at deploying, again, building out this SASE architecture as well. So again, it's an interesting approach to how we've migrated away from that complex environment. But this is what the more simple version of this looks like. And I always, I like to see, again, all the types of connectivity options, so people working from anywhere. Again, we're all working from anywhere today. The ability to just connect directly to, again, the services we are looking to consume with, again, those controls in place. I mentioned before about looking at, again, analyzing for, again, drive-by attacks, looking at how we can actually analyze payloads and share information also with our ecosystem partners. It's quite an interesting opportunity here that you can see because it also allows for, again, how to secure, again, BYOD third-party devices and how to also, in many cases, do this without having to put a client or having any footprint on that device itself. And the goal of SASE is to offer all these different traffic steering methods that can be leveraged. But it's also something we've seen an increase in, well, how do people actually secure IoT, OT services as well? Again, out into the relevant IoT, OT cloud service that manages many of those sensors and devices as well. So you can see here, this is, a much more simple approach, and it follows on the same principles as zero trust architecture. So you'll have a primary enforcement point at the cloud level, but you, of course, may also be doing elements of, again, device posture checking as well to verify if there is a risk to the organization. So taking elements of Secure Access Service Edge and applying that to Zero Trust, these are all the different types of variables that you actually start to look at. Again, as somebody that's run security operations teams in the past and somebody that's followed the kind of Jericho Forum for over 20 years, context is king. Whenever you see an event, you have to understand, again, well, what was the risk to the organization? Did the risk come from a device that perhaps is poorly configured, has perhaps known vulnerabilities, hasn't been updated recently, has the device perhaps been lost, stolen, etc. Having that, at least some of that visibility is absolutely key. Then it's looking at the GeoIP, the location specifically of, again, the source, the destination traffic. Again, we saw some great talks. There was a great talk yesterday about IP spoofing. But of course, the majority of times you can get a better understanding of somebody's location based on geo-IP. And of course, that can be used to identify if you're seeing a multitude of connections into the same cloud service that isn't going through, again, a specific source. You then have, of course, if somebody has been compromised, perhaps there has been, again, remote access, Trojan enabled on that device itself. Again, has the behavior changed? Is there some unusual things occurring on the device? So can we say now that perhaps there is a likelihood that the employee, the person that owns that device, perhaps may have been compromised? But this can be said for the same for IoT and OT devices as well. If again behavior changes, it will be a variable that you would need to consider. Then you even have elements of the app trust, the incident trust, the activity trust, the data trust. All of these key elements are critical in understanding, again, a potential incident to the organization. I like to refer to this as the graphic equalizer. Right? If anybody's had the graphic equalizer, their home hi-fi stack system, to understand again changes, perhaps again baselines, etc. This is a great way to consider this. But of course, you only need one of these to be considered perhaps a high risk to the organization for you then to take action. There's also elements around looking at access control and coaching. So, and if somebody does go to a high risk application that is a new instance to the organization, you may, of course, by default have to put in a block action or look to educate or again coach the employee. But also, if you can start looking around building out that context and applying all these elements to formalize again the zero trust capabilities here. So again, instead of just using identity or using again device, it's understanding all those elements in parallel in many cases to look for that outlier which would require an action to be taken. But it doesn't end there. Again, some of the common challenges we've seen is not just about implementing or looking at SASE as a new architecture with elements of zero trust, but looking at how you can also further consolidate, integrate, and orchestrate. I shared this slide with our CIO a few weeks ago, and I said that's what the CIO mandate pretty much has been the last few years. It's how again organizations from a technology and IT perspective look to consolidate many technologies. As we've built out that complexity, it is around starting with consolidation. It's then how we integrate many of these technologies also and capabilities, and then look to orchestrate. Now, again, with most things, there's no one solution for everything. So there's usually a best-of-breed capability here. But the goal is many of these platforms have to be built on open standards. They have to be built based on sharing information, again, through APIs. So again, the example I can share, we had an organization that was accessing a SaaS service. The SaaS service had been compromised. Even the SaaS provider themselves didn't know at a point in time that this SaaS service has been compromised. The organization was going through, they had a full SASE platform. They were able to identify that there was a compromise, there was a redirect. It was using a DGA to create a delivery mechanism. There was a payload that was analyzed, again, in a sandbox. That sandbox created the OC that was then shared through, again, threat intelligence services down to the endpoint. So within that time, again, we're looking at time to detection, of course, always looking at that, but also time to mitigation. So in this example, again, from the event of seeing a redirect to the ability to analyze the malware binary, to creating IOC, to sharing that to the endpoint across the estate, again, was a matter of kind of minutes compared to perhaps hours. But of course, there's always going to be an element of requiring a human to intervene and perform further analysis. But in this case, again, you have some key platforms that you can take that information from. If, again, somebody's behavior has changed based on systems they're accessing through the identity service, if it's through detection only, SIM, SOAR type capabilities, again, you can take those actions and feed those back into that SASE point. Which is why SASE actually is critical in terms of this, because it is that inline control out to web cloud services. So to finish off, these are the key benefits. We've seen organizations that have moved to this approach. I like to talk about this as, again, the RAC triad, not the CIA triad, but the RAC triad. But looking at how organizations can start to better understand and manage risks to their organization. So first off is better understanding cloud and getting better visibility of which cloud services are being used in that organization. It's quite interesting. Very few organizations have a great picture of their full cloud estate. Many of the cases, of course, they have the understanding of their public cloud use, but they're perhaps not an understanding of their SaaS use. So again, by looking at, this type of approach, better visibility, better, decisions that can be made based on managing that risk. Of course, restricting data loss. I already mentioned some of the new kind of egress points for organizations to have to consider. But again, the goal we're seeing with organizations, they're looking to apply, data protection on more of those egress points than they have done before, rather than the obvious endpoint network kind of web channels. And then it's also looking at managing that third-party risk, understanding, the third parties that are being worked with, the information that's been shared with third parties, who is responsible for what, understanding those aspects. The visibility here is key. And then overall, reducing that attack surface. Going back to one of the first slides I shared, the attack surface has grown because of course, a dispersed workforce and, dispersed use of cloud services. Looking at increased agility. So this is great for an organization that's considering, well, how do I, allow people to do more or have more access to services and not have to go through multiple inspection points. If you've ever had to, connect to a service and had to VPN and had to go back calling through, a data center, the challenge. All right. So here, direct access with cloud peering, this is ultimately where, SASE plays a key part. Supporting, new business models, so allowing people to experiment, allowing people to set up and spin up, new cloud instances, for instance, would be a great way to, further support this, but putting in those controls that perhaps perform continuous security assessments to ensure that that service is being securely configured, especially if it contains any confidential, sensitive data. And that can actually help and reduce friction in the organization, reduce the number of exceptions in web proxies, for instance, but also allow people to further accelerate their cloud adoption. And then finally, optimizing cost. Right? It's a byproduct of looking at this as a more modern approach. Of course, there's going to be project costs to make them a migration, but in many cases, it's a goal for the organization to reduce the number of vendors and services that are being used. That's from a security perspective, but also, of course, from a cloud perspective. Allows the organization to perhaps also simplify operations. Again, if you're looking at zero trust architecture, looking at policy enforcement points, the fewer policies you have, the fewer challenges you have in terms of managing those policies, it does help with those, operational efficiencies as well. And then, of course, it's a great opportunity to eliminate some of that technical debt that has been procured over time to really support the organization as it's gone through a form of digital transformation. I think we are now definitely moving towards a known digital era. But of course, we can't rely on many of those technologies and capabilities that we've had over the last 20 years for that as well. So key, when you add all those three things together, it's great to build a business case to show that business value. Most organizations, when presenting to the board, you need to have a business case that focuses on more than just, cost reduction or more than just improving agility, ability, productivity for the organization, and also more than just, managing and reducing risk. Again, a great opportunity will be to combine all three elements to showcase the business value there. So again, thank you very much for your time. That's, looking at showing business value with SASE. I'm available for any questions. If anybody does have a question, I'd be more than happy to answer. Yes, we have a question already. Great. If we don't have time, or if you'd prefer to ask your question a bit later on, we have our stand over outside. Come over to the Netscope stand. More than happy to talk to you. Or you can reach out to me. Again, feel free to ping me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about anything we've discussed today.
Hi. Thanks a lot for the presentation. It was very clear. I have one question, and it's a recurrent topic related to Zero Trust and SASE, because in Zero Trust, the concept of perimeter disappears.
Yeah.
So all these controls that are amazing should be the same inside your data center. Like I don't care where my application sits, if it's in the data center or in the cloud, but I want all these controls. So how do you consolidate that? How do you take what you are putting in the edge that is great, but have the same insight. How do you do it in terms of traffic? Then all the traffic needs to go out of my data center to go inside into my data center again? And
that's a really good question. It's a really good question. So there are still options. Of course, you could do run again software-defined networking on your on-prem organization, so you don't necessarily have to go out to the cloud and back in. That could be an option. There seems to be lots and lots of options also appearing in more use cases, specifically on zero trust network access as well. I refer to it more as zero trust application access because it really does depend what's running on your on-prem. In most cases, it probably will be an application. It will be an application stack, and you would typically, again, you look to deploy that through a piece of software-defined. In many cases, a publisher that would sit in front of that application that allows people to connect in. If they're outside the organization, if they're connecting in, then of course that would then have to go through typically a SASE service. But if they're inside the organization, again, you can utilize the zero trust aspect. You could integrate, yeah. The goal, I think the goal for many organizations today is have an opportunity to either integrate or in many cases replace. So there could be an option also to integrate or replace. It really depends on the use case, of course. Right. I know everybody's really hungry and ready to go to lunch, right? But again, thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.